For the last couple of years, I've been on a bit of a quest to try and find some sort of smart remote control devices that can control devices on my local network over some sort of local API. Be it an HTTP API, MQTT, some sort of telnet interface, I'm not really fussy, but what I want is some sort of regular remote control type device that can talk to devices directly over my local network. There's a bunch of different smart remotes on the market, but none of them really fitted this bill. They either only support connections directly to sort of set-top box devices, either using infrared or Bluetooth, and then the ones that do support some sort of network control, it's only really to sort of cloud-hosted to your smart life type devices. They don't really allow you to connect to some sort of local devices through the likes of Home Assistant or anything like that. There's a few sort of Kickstarter projects that have kind of come and gone over the years, one of which I am actually waiting on to receive to actually try out, and those look a bit more promising, but being sort of small volume Kickstarter projects, they're not really ideal where you need a bunch of remotes very quickly. And in my setup here, I need a bunch of these, probably 3 or 4 to have them in all different rooms, so a sort of one-off from Kickstarter isn't really going to fit the bill. I need something where I can buy a bunch of remote controls very easily and have them work. And yeah, it's been a bit of an awkward quest because I just haven't been able to find something that fits this bill. Until now. And what we have here is the Sofabaton X1S. Now these have been out for quite a while, along with the previous X1 series, and I've not really looked into them, I've basically ignored them. Because like all the other devices I've talked about, these only really supported infrared devices, Bluetooth devices, potentially some sort of RF devices, or they did support network control, but only of Roku's, Philips Hue and Sonos devices, not any kind of custom third-party devices. So it just didn't really fit the bill for me. However, someone recently commented on one of my videos saying that their Sofabaton X1S remote recently gained a new feature, allowing you to create custom commands over a local HTTP API. So this remote control can issue HTTP commands to devices on my network and essentially give me that full local control that I've wanted. So I immediately bought one because that seems absolutely perfect. So in this video, I'm not going to go into full detail showing the X1S remote entirely and show how it all works completely for controlling lots of device over IR and Bluetooth and things like that. There's lots of other reviews out there on this product for that. But what I want to do in this is focus particularly on that new HTTP feature because it's really not publicized. It's really interesting. They've kind of launched that feature onto it and it does work, but it's not mentioned anywhere on the Sofabaton website. And the only other mention I can find online is from the person that commented on my YouTube video posting on the Sofabaton forum. It's been a completely silent announcement, so really interesting to try this out and see how well it works. In addition to buying the X1S, I also somewhat optimistically bought the older Sofabaton X1. These are a lot cheaper because this has obviously been replaced with the X1S and therefore these are being sold off for a much lower price. Unfortunately, this doesn't have that new feature. I kind of hope they backport it or the software would be similar enough that it would work, but it doesn't. So if you want to do this, you need to use the X1S. You can't use the older X1. Now, there's one thing I'll quickly mention though, if you want to use both these devices to provide some sort of local network control, is another option is called emulated Roku, which is a Python library I think you can run on your own server or you can run it as part of Home Assistant. And emulated Roku will basically pretend to be a Roku device on the network, and then both of these can discover that virtual Roku, control it over the network, and then you can use the kind of control inputs into emulated Roku in Home Assistant in general. And that does work, but it's not quite as flexible. You're kind of working with predefined buttons and you can't really rename the buttons and things like that like I would want. So that's why I'm going for the X1S with the actual proper HTTP control. But if you already have a Sofabaton X1, if you just look up emulated Roku, that could get you quite far for this. So I'm not going to go into detail on the emulated Roku setup, but I wanted to mention that in case people do have the X1 and want to try it out. But with the X1S, not only can you use emulated Roku, but you can also have a full local HTTP API control. So now let's take a look at what you get in the box itself. So we'll take a look at what you get in the box and then we'll get it all set up and try it out. But this does work. It is far from perfect, but we'll talk about some of the caveats along the way. So that's the remote itself. We'll put that off to the side. And then in the box, you're going to get a couple of manuals. You then get a hub, which we'll take a look at here. It's a little sort of hub device. Makes a horrible squeaky noise with that plastic. There, you get the Sofabaton hub. And then you get a couple of IR blasters. So this device itself has an IR blaster built in, but what you can also do is it comes with these little additional IR blasters. One of these is just a single IR blaster. The other one is a connector to 2 separate IR blasters. And these can plug into the 2 ports on the back of the hub. So this is quite nice. So it means if you've say got this hub hidden away in an AV cabinet, but then and the IR signal from this doesn't reach your TV that's maybe sitting on top of the cabinet, you could run one of these IR blasters out of your cabinet and just stick that to the front of the TV. So it means you don't need to have this necessarily at the complete opposite end of the room pointing towards all your AV stuff. You can kind of hide it away a little bit, which is quite nice. That's going to be quite useful. You then get a power adapter and a couple of USB-A to C cables. One to power the hub and one to charge the remote. So now here we have the core hardware out of the kit, which is the remote and the hub. And the way it works with the Sofabaton X1 series is you need to have one remote and one hub per room. They kind of work as a pair. It's not the sort of system where you'd buy one hub for your entire house and a bunch of different remotes. The hub is kind of paired to each remote. And the reason for that is the remote itself doesn't have any kind of IR capability. There's no IR blaster or IR emitter on the remote itself. That is done by the hub, either from a built-in infrared LED in the hub itself, which I presume is somewhere on the front, or through those external IR blasters that you can plug into the back. So I'd just like to bear in mind that you do need to have one hub per room. You can't really try and save money by buying one hub and a bunch of remotes. You do just need to buy them as a pair. If you take a quick look at the hub itself, you can see that's it there. Basic black device. You can actually mount it, which is nice. And then around the back, you've got those two ports for the IR emitters, a button there for sort of pairing and factory resetting and all that kind of stuff, and then a USB-C port for power. Now, one slight complaint about this that's not a huge issue, but just important to bear in mind, is this is a USB-C port, but it does that sort of thing that a lot of cheap devices do, where they only expect 5 volts on that USB-C port, and they won't work with any kind of smart USB-C chargers that do USB power delivery and can output different voltages. It doesn't have the appropriate resistors or anything in it that can tell your power adapter to supply this with 5 volts. So what that means is if I say plug into some sort of smart USB charger, for example, down here I've got a USB-C cable that's connected to an Apple USB-C charger. If I plug that in there, it won't power up or do anything because this isn't telling that charger the correct voltage to output. So it's not a huge issue. What it basically means is if you want to power this up, you probably want to avoid using a direct USB-C to C cable into a USB-C charger, and instead use a USB-C to A cable into a USB-A charger, and that'll power it up absolutely fine. So just something to bear in mind if you're trying to try this out, because when I first got this, I plugged it into a USB-C charger that I had sitting on my desk. It didn't work, thought it was broken, actually wasn't, just needed to use a USB-A to C cable. Thankfully, that only applies to the hub. The remote itself does work over a smart USB-C charger. So again, with the same Apple charger here, we can plug that in there and the remote will actually charge off of that. So that's not a huge issue because the hub's the sort of thing you plug in once, you leave it sitting plugged in. So I don't mind trying to use a special cable just for that. It would be more awkward if the remote had the same issue because the remote's the sort of thing you might just want to charge with a random USB-C charger you've got sitting on your couch. At least with this, I don't have that issue. It will just kind of charge from any USB-C source. So that's not the end of the world. Just something to bear in mind if you try and plug this in. It's not broken. You might just need to use a different cable. And then next up, you get the remote. So mine's already set up. I have already set this up just to kind of test it off camera, but we will take a look at that later. But that's it there, sort of already woken up. You've got a menu on the screen. We'll take a look at all this in more detail. And then a bunch of buttons. Now, the way this works is you've got this sort of little scroll wheel here. And this is what interacts with the screen. So you scroll that up and down, and that picks different options on the screen. You can then click it in, and it lets you scroll through the screen. You've then got a back button here, which is a little bit awkwardly placed, but again, this lets you go back through the menus on the screen. And then the off button is used to turn off activities, and we'll take a look at that later. So it's not a touch screen. Everything on the screen is interacted with this wheel here, and then the buttons all down here are dedicated to controlling the connected devices. It can be a little bit awkward just to kind of get your head around that at first, because a number of times you're like, oh, I want to go down, so you start pressing the down button here, and it's not controlling the screen. You've got to kind of remind yourself that this bit here controls the screen, this here controls the connected devices. But once you get your head around it, that's fine. And actually, I do quite like having this wheel rather than having a touch screen, because a lot of these smart remotes, you've got a touch screen right at the top, and it's really awkward to like reposition your hand to try and use it, and it's just not very tactile. Having a very simple interface that is literally controlled by scrolling a wheel and clicking it is very easy. My only complaint here really is that back button is a bit of an awkward position. If you're down here controlling something or you're using that wheel, you then got to really reposition the remote to hit that, but it's not the end of the world. But yeah, that's kind of the form factor there. And then down here, you've got a bunch of different buttons, and these sorts of buttons you can just kind of map within the software to whatever you want. So in my case, these will be issuing HTTP commands to devices. This can equally be issuing IR commands to devices and all that kind of stuff. Now, because this is designed as a more smart remote, it doesn't have any kind of number buttons or anything like that. You can use them, but if you want to use numbers, what you'll end up doing is on the screen, you'll use a scroll wheel to scroll up and down through a list of numbers and press it in to pick the numbers. So if you're going to want to use picking a lot of channels by numbers, this remote isn't ideal for that, but it's got a decent selection of buttons here you can use. So yeah, that's a look at the hardware. What I'll now do is I'll quickly get the app set up, and then we'll take a look at the software side of things, because that's where it really gets interesting with that local API control. Okay, so now here we are inside the Sofabaton app. Now I've already set this all up and got it all working, so there is a bit of setup process when you initially want to install all this. The first thing you need to do is set up a user account, which is a complaint. I really don't like the fact you need a user account for what is a fairly local offline device, but there's not really any other options like this out there in terms of a product that does what I need, so I'm willing to accept that. But yeah, you set up the account, you then need to plug the hub in, discover the hub over Bluetooth. I think you hold it down a pairing button on the back of the hub, it then goes through a little wizard, sets up connected to Wi-Fi, and then once it's all set up, you come into this interface here. Now, as standard, you won't have any devices showing up here, so what you want to do is then add devices. And the idea here is you'd add a device for each device you have in your sort of room or your AV setup. So you'd add a device for your TV, your AV receiver, your set-top box, all that kind of stuff. I've got some stuff already set up here, but this is more my custom setup, but we'll take a quick look at the rough sort of official way you're meant to do it. So you'd press plus up here and pick the device you want. So you can either pick infrared, you can either search model where you can kind of search for your particular device. There's a lot of codes in here. Some of them, they do generally work, but it can be a little bit glitchy. For example, I have had issues where I picked my exact AV receiver model, didn't work. But I picked the American version of that AV receiver, which is a slightly different model number, and that worked fine, even though I've got the European or UK version of that model, which was the model I initially picked. So you do sometimes need to play about with some of the models a little bit, but you can usually get it working. If you want to see more about the sort of setup for infrared devices and stuff like that, check out my Sofabaton U1 video I did, which is basically a similar idea, but it's a remote control that's only infrared and it doesn't have the hub. On that video, I went more through the sort of infrared setup process, which is very similar on the X1. But yeah, you can go through here, you can kind of pick whatever device you want, pick the model and do that. There's also options here for either learning from original remotes or sort of testing different commands, but that's kind of the infrared setup there. And then once you've gone through that, it'll add the device to your hub and then you can control it. So for example, here we have the AV receiver. This was set up from an infrared command. This is an infrared device. You can go into that. It gives you a kind of virtual remote control to control that device, or you can press edit. And then in here, you can either add repair commands to like learn commands from a remote. You can test them, you can rename them, all that kind of stuff. You can assign commands to remote keys. So you've got the buttons on the remote itself, and you can pick which of these buttons map to which infrared command. So that's how kind of an infrared device would work. The other type of device you have is Bluetooth. So you can go into here, and again, you can pick other sorts of devices in here. So things like NVIDIA Shields, PlayStations, Android TV devices, Chromecasts, all that kind of stuff. You can do all that through here. Now, none of the devices I have are Bluetooth devices, so I'm probably not going to use that, but it is nice to have that option if you have any of those devices. There's also an RF option, which is interesting. The Sofabaton X1 doesn't seem to have this, so this might be exclusive to the X1S as well. But if you go into that, you can pick this particular frequency, so either 433 MHz or 315 MHz. And then in here, you can just learn devices from existing RF remotes. So that could be potentially useful. Now, not like lots of devices use different frequencies. You get lots of 2.4 GHz RF devices nowadays, but it is interesting having that. So you can potentially learn from RF remotes, which is potentially quite a useful feature. And then the final option we have here is this Wi-Fi option. Now, interestingly, on this screen, it still says what it's always said for years, which is where it says only supports Roku, Sonos, and Philips Hue, which is what I said before. But if you go into this, it'll start scanning the devices for various things. This Home Assistant option that's showing up is actually a virtual Roku instance, so ignore that normally. I've just been playing a bit with virtual Roku. So in this list, you would see all of your various Roku, Philips Hue, and Sonos devices. But then if you look down the bottom of the screen, we have this brand new option for create, just notice that was spelled wrong, create a virtual device for IP control. So if you go into that, it then gives you this new interface. So in here, what you can do is you can enter a command name. So that's just the name of the command you'd want to show up on the interface, be it power on, volume up, whatever. You can then enter a URL. So that's the URL it will issue an HTTP request to. You can then pick a request method. So you can pick get, post, or put. And then if you want, you can provide additional headers, potentially things like authentication, stuff like that. And you can also provide a body for your request. If you're say sending a post request, you can put some JSON in here. So what you would do is you'd go through that, you'd add a command in for each of the commands on your device, you'd then give the device a name, and then you'd save it, and then once you've done that, the device will show up here. So what we can see here is a few different devices I've created that we'll talk about later, but these are all created as custom HTTP devices. So if we go into, say, for example, lighting, this is one that I've set up. We see we've got a bunch of different options here for controlling some lights. This is just a sort of test device. Go to Edit and go to Edit IP Command List. Here we can see all the commands I've set up. And if we go into one of these, we'll get that interface we saw before, which is where you set the command up. So here we have a command set turn the light blue. So the command's called blue. The URL we've put in there, it's a GET request, and then there's no other parameters specified. And then in terms of the URL, what we have is, this is set up in Node-RED. We'll take a look at that flow in a minute. But we have the URL to the Node-RED API endpoint, which is called remote control. And then into this, I've added a bunch of GET parameters. So the type of the command is lighting, the room is living room, and the command is blue. This is the API I've built. This would be completely bespoke to your setup. Now, there's only one weird caveat I want to mention at this point, and that is that you'll notice here, I'm specifying an IP address, not a host name. If at this point, instead of an IP address, you put in a host name, for example, homeassistant.lan.whatever, into this here, when you save the command, the app, what I'm presuming is the app itself, will then do a DNS lookup and change that host name for an IP address, and then it's the IP address that gets saved on the hub. Now that's just something quite important to bear in mind, because if you're running some sort of API behind some sort of load balancer, which would be looking for the particular host name to route your request to the appropriate endpoint, that's not going to work. When you set up your API, it needs to be accessible directly based on the IP address, not any sort of host name, because the device, as far as I can tell, doesn't have the ability to make a request to a host name, only an IP address. So just something to bear in mind, if you've got any kind of reverse proxy, traffic, something like that in front of your API, that might not work. You do need to be able to connect directly on an IP address. Just something to bear in mind. But yep, that's what we've got set up there for my endpoints. We have, the blue command that controls that. We can check the other one, for example, off is the same thing. We can go into here, same endpoint, but the type is lighting, room, living room, and then command is off. So we've got a bunch of these buttons created for each command that I want to issue in the lighting remote. Once those are all set up, they'll show on this big list of commands here. And then what you can also do is go into assign commands for remote keys like before. And in here, you can pick the different commands on the device and then pick which HTTP command you want that button to issue. So for example, with my setup here, the plus button issues the on command, the minus button issues the off command to the lights. And we'll take a look at all this later. And then the color buttons will just turn the light to that color. I was very much testing this here. But yeah, you can then map those buttons like that. So that was a quick look at the lighting setup because it's the simplest one to explain. But my main goal of this setup is to control my multi-room video and audio distribution system, where I have an HDMI matrix switch in my comms rack with a bunch of little different devices connected to that, and then that's routed to TVs throughout the house. The idea would be that I'll have a Sofabaton X1S remote in every room, and on that remote there'll be a button to pick, say, watch Chromecast A or watch Apple TV. It'll switch the HDMI matrix switch to that particular source for that particular room, and then the Sofabaton remote will control that connected device, be it the Apple TV, the Chromecast, or whatever. So this is a very proprietary setup, and I probably do need to do a dedicated video on this, but I don't want to go too much into the weeds of it because I'm trying to demonstrate this remote, not my particular setup. But what I've done here is I've created 3 different devices for this particular setup. The first one is the AV receiver. Now this only applies to the living room, which is what this remote's for, because in the living room I want the remote control to control the volume of the AV receiver directly, not anything else. So I've added the AV receiver in here, and I've mapped the volume control and all those buttons. This is an infrared device, so I just added it from the code library, so that was fairly easy. Then for the network control, I wanted a way to change the source and to issue commands to devices such as the Chromecast or the Apple TV. So to change source, what I did is I've created a device here, which is an HTTP device, and I've added a bunch of different commands for switching sources. So we can look at the command list here. We can see here we have one for Apple TV, so we have the IP address, endpoint remote control, the type is media source, room is living room, and the source is Apple TV. And in the Node-RED flow, what this does is when this command's received, it will change the particular media source for that room to Apple TV or Chromecast or whatever device is picked, and then that goes to a separate Node-RED flow that I already have that will then update the output mapping on the HDMI matrix. So I've got all these commands here that will switch the video sources around within Home Assistant, and then on top of that, I want some way to control the connected devices from the Sofabaton remote. Now, I'm fortunate here that my HDMI matrix is able to issue HDMI CEC commands to connected devices. CEC being the HDMI protocol that lets your TV remote control your set-top box and things like that. Essentially, you can issue basic remote control type commands to a device over HDMI. So what I've done here is I've created a device called CEC Remote, and if we go into this, it's got a bunch of different sort of basic commands I would want to issue to any kind of connected set-top box. So we've got back, down, left menu, play, pause, previous, right, up, next, enter. Don't quite know what the ordering is there, but all these are kind of commands I would want to issue to the Apple TV, the Chromecast, things like that. And as you can see in the URL, it just is the type is CEC command, the room is again living room, and then the command is down, command is left, command is menu. And then have some logic in Node-RED that we'll take a look at later, that when it receives this command, it looks at the particular room that's specified in the HTTP request, it looks up which source is being displayed in that room, and then it sends the specified CEC command from the command in the URL to that device using the HDMI matrix. So if I say issue this URL for, say, I don't know, back, that then goes to the Node-RED flow. That Node-RED flow looks up a particular room, works out what device is in there, and sends the CEC back command to that device. So what that means, I can use a Sofabaton remote to control this CEC remote device, which I've also mapped to various remote control buttons, and that will control whatever device is currently active in that room. And that works really, really well. Of course, if you had other devices, you could add them in here as well. So say you had a Roku, for example, you could add that with the Roku network control. If you had some sort of device that didn't support CEC, you could add a different endpoint for that. You could add an infrared device in here if you had an infrared set-top box and control it from this. I've just been able to simplify everything to use a single CEC remote device because thankfully all my devices can be controlled over HDMI CEC. So now that's great. What you essentially have here is a device for source selection you can use to pick sources, a device for CEC remote you can use to control those devices, a device for AV receiver to control my receiver, and another device for lighting. But this would all be quite cumbersome if you had to kind of constantly switch device on the remote. You need to pick source selection device, pick the source, go back, pick the CEC remote, control that. It's not ideal. What the Sofabaton X1 has is the concept of activities that lets you group multiple devices under a single sort of named activity. So we go into here, I've got a few examples. We have watch Chromecast A, watch Chromecast B, and lighting. And whenever you pick any of these, it will automatically switch the source to that device. So if I pick watch Chromecast B, it will switch automatically to Chromecast B, turn the TV on, turn the TV to the right input, power up the Chromecast, and then the remote control will become the remote for that device. Similarly for lighting, if I pick lighting, the remote control will become a remote control to control lighting. So what we'll do is we'll quickly take a look at creating one of these activities because that'll kind of make it a bit clearer how it works. So I'll create one for watching the Apple TV because I've not got that yet. So we'll go to plus, and then what you need to do is pick all of the devices you want to involve in that activity. So that's either the remote control for the main device you want to control, the source selection device, the AV receiver you want to control the volume, or if there's another device you might want to issue a custom command to, you need to pick that here. So we need to pick all the devices we want to use. So for controlling the Apple TV, we need the CEC remote because we're going to control it over CEC. We need the source selection device because we want to issue source selection commands to pick the Apple TV. And for the living room, we also want the AV receiver because I want to use that to control the volume. Other rooms, I probably wouldn't be picking the AV receiver. I'd be adding a remote for the TV itself and picking the TV here. You then press next. The next stage will let you switch all the relevant devices to different sources. So in my case here, I've set the AV receiver and CEC remote to not really have any source selection ability, but because I have the special source selection remote, at this point here, I would pick the source I want to switch to. So for example, here I want to pick the Apple TV. So what that says is when this activity starts, it will trigger the Apple TV command of the source selection device. And then the rest of the source selection, changing the matrix around, triggering my AV receiver, all that sort of stuff is done separately through Home Assistant. We'll then press next. There's a bunch of options for power control. I'm not going to go into all that here. There'll be videos that will show more about how to set up Sofabaton activities. Essentially with this, you can make it so when you pick an activity, it powers on and off the relevant devices. This can work well, but it can also be a bit awkward. For example, my AV receiver and my TV do have obviously infrared power on off commands, but there isn't a separate command for power on versus power off. It's just a single command that toggles the power state. So when you start using that kind of power control into these activities, it can get a bit awkward because your devices can go out of sync from each other and you end up with a situation that your TV's on and then you try and start an activity and it turns the TV off because it just sends that power command. So personally, I try and avoid having the power control here and just leave it all off and don't set any power control up. You can do it, but you just need to watch because you can end up with power states going out of sync. And on this next screen, you can pick which different buttons on the remote are mapped to different devices. After the fact, you can go in and remap these and assign specific things around. This just kind of does a sort of bulk mapping to save a bit of time. So in this case here, for example, we want the volume buttons to map to the AV receiver. That's correct, so we can press next. And then now for all the other buttons, we don't want them to control the AV receiver. We want them to control the CEC remote device, and that'll then pass through to the Apple TV. We're going to press next here, and then we want to name this, so we're going to call it Watch Apple TV. And then we're going to go and pick just another picture, press complete, give it a little second, and that'll create an activity. So we can now rearrange these, so we can slide that up, you can kind of put it wherever you want in the list. That'll also rearrange it on the remote control itself, which we'll see shortly. We can then go into this activity, we can press edit, we can edit this activity. I'm just going to rename that because I've not put a space in Apple TV and that's going to bug me. There we go, that's better. So now here you have the different options for the activity. You can go into assign commands for remote keys, which is basically the same thing you have for a device. You can pick a particular device on the button on the remote, pick the device you want to issue that control from, say for example, source selection. You can pick the command you want to issue from that, confirm that, and then if you do that, it will then map it to that button on the device. So you can kind of remap all the buttons on the remote to all the different devices you've added to the activity. And it's also interesting here, you do have a difference between a short press and a long press, so you could use that as well if you wanted to. By default, they're all set up for short press, but that could possibly be quite nice to have long press options in there as well. So that's that option there. The next option you have are for favorite keys. Now these are keys that will be displayed on the screen of the remote when you switch to that activity. We'll take a look at this later. But what you can do here is if you've got another option you want to then add to the screen of the device, when you've picked the activity, you'd scroll up and down to that particular command, you'd press it, it would trigger that command, you can add them in here. From here, you can either add normal keys where you'd pick a particular device, pick a particular command, press confirm, and it'll add it to the remote and it'll display it on the screen. That works absolutely fine, but if you do that, you can rearrange them and reorder them, but you can't change what that text says. It'll just have the name of the device and the command. The potentially nicer option is you can press add macro keys. And in here, you can kind of give your button a custom name. So for example, we can create a button here for test, and then you can add one or more commands to this to kind of have a single option on the screen that you can select and it'll trigger a bunch of different commands. So you press add command, you can say pick a particular device. I'm just doing complete random nonsense here, but you say source selection Chromecast B, you could add a delay if you want, and then you could add another command. So you could say CEC remote command previous. This is complete nonsense, but you could do that there. So what that now means is under the Apple TV option on the remote, when I pick that activity, I'll have a button that says test, and when I click that, it will switch the source to Chromecast B, wait half a second, and then send a previous command on the CEC remote. So that can be really nice if you want to have commands displayed on the screen of the device, just to kind of give you a bit more of a shortcut. For example, you can have options for different streaming services, for example, Netflix or Apple TV or Prime or whatever, and when you pick that, it will then automatically launch that app on the relevant device and take you to the right area. So you could do all that through here. It's really quite flexible. The final options you have under each activity is startup settings and shutdown settings. This is where you can set a bunch of commands to happen when you first of all start an activity on the remote or when you switch away from it again. For example, in here you can have it where it would power on and off devices. As you can see by default, it automatically in the startup section adds an activity for a source selection, so it'll automatically pick the Apple TV source. That's from the initial setup wizard. You could change that there. If you wanted to add additional commands in here, you could. And similarly, you can add shutdown settings. For example, you could have it so when you switch out of a certain activity, you could power off the particular devices or things like that. Now, the only caveat out here, especially say for having things for shutting down activities, is if you're going to ever want to switch activities, say for example, because I have an activity for lighting control, you might be watching TV and then want to switch to the lighting activity to control the lighting. You probably don't want any shutdown activities on your AV activities. Because if you were to do that, for example, have it so if you switch off the Apple TV activity, it turns off the Apple TV. That means that anytime you switch to the lighting activity to control the lighting, your Apple TV is going to turn off, which you might not want. So for my setup here, I don't have any of my activities do anything when I switch away from them. I just have them so when I switch them on, this TV and AV setup will switch to the correct source. Similarly, I have a lighting activity. This doesn't really do much though. This just is essentially all it has is just a mapping for all of the lighting buttons in the lighting remote onto the physical remote. And it just means that from the activities list, I've got a lighting option I can pick there. I don't need to go separately into the devices section and specifically pick the lighting control device. So that's a run through of devices and activities. And with that, that's all you really need to do to set up this remote to work. There's another section here for me, which is like your kind of profile. There's a bunch of settings in here. There's an API interface, which looks hopeful, but essentially all this is it lets you trigger activities by issuing an HTTP command to Sofabaton servers that will then trigger an activity from your device. Not something I really want to do, especially because it's completely unauthenticated. There's an option for sharing code base. Apparently this is just to let you kind of, if you've learnt custom remotes into your device, you can share it with other Sofabaton users. Again, not something I'm really going to be needing. You can switch to other devices, so if you've got multiple hubs on your network, you can switch between them. You can go into settings, you can name your hub, things like that. And in here, the important one is the sync remote button, which will automatically sync the hub with the remote control. I found this does kind of happen automatically when you change settings, but I found in the past where I'll maybe program a bunch of commands in, and then some of them just won't work on the physical remote until you manually do a sync. That's kind of the thing with this. It does work, but it is quite glitchy in lots of little areas. The software is just not quite perfect, so little things like that can be a little bit annoying, so you do need something to manually sync it, and that's how you do it there. Other than that, it's a lot of software, FAQs and privacy policies and stuff that we won't really go into, but that's kind of the app setup. So now before we take a look at it working, there's only really one more gripe about this whole sort of software experience, and that is that it's very inefficient in terms of your time setting it up. For example, there's no way to say clone a particular device. If I say create a remote here for a particular device and I just need to very slightly tweak it for another device, I can't copy it. I just have to set up another one completely from scratch. Now with the HTTP API, it's not too bad because you can just copy and paste the URL, but it does just require a lot of manual setup. You can't duplicate any of these devices. And even more annoyingly, you can't duplicate devices between remote controls. I can't have a couple of Sofabaton X1Ss and just clone them to each other because I will probably be setting up a bunch of these in different rooms. For every single remote, I'm going to have to set it up and do this complete manual setup process, pasting in all the URLs for every single remote, which is quite annoying. It'd be really nice to improve the software to allow sort of export and import of configuration, or the ability to, the dream would be to, for example, allow you to export it to say an XML file and then you can customize it in there, then re-import it to give you a bit more efficient control. Unfortunately, it's not possible. Out of interest, I did actually do a Wireshark capture between my phone and the Sofabaton hub to see if I could sort of make any sense of the protocol that they use to communicate, to see if I could write a script that would automate the configuration of the hub. It would be possible because it does seem to be a completely unauthenticated API, but it's just some sort of low-level TCP API. There's no sort of HTTP interface or anything to it. So it would be possible, but it would require quite a lot of reverse engineering. It's not a easy to interpret HTTP API, unfortunately. So yeah, there's the app setup there. It's not perfect. This device is far from a completely polished, refined device. There's a lot of little quirks here and there, but it is so nice that I now have a remote control device where I can simply go in and specify a bunch of HTTP commands and map them to a physical remote control. So yeah, that's enough rambling about the app there. Let's now jump down to the living room and take a look at this final setup actually working. Okay, so now let's take a look at this working in practice. Now, for a bit of context, just for people who haven't seen my previous videos, what I have is an HDMI distribution switch in my rack in my garage, and that's got a few different devices connected to it. It's got 2 Chromecasts, an Apple TV, and I'll be adding more in the future. That's then connected to this TV and all the other TVs in the house over HD-based T receivers. So the HD-based T receiver plugs into my AV receiver in this cabinet, and then that receiver connects into TV over HDMI. So the whole aim with this process here is to let me control all those devices in my comms rack from single remotes in each of the rooms. So the dream sort of master plan is that each room will have one of these Sofabaton remotes to control all the connected devices. So first of all, let's take a look at the interface on the remote itself. So when you first start the remote up, it gives you these options here. So you have activities, devices, and settings. Settings are just some basic settings on the remote itself, nothing you really need to touch that often. Then you have activities and devices. And this kind of mirrors what you have in the app. If you go into devices, you get a list of each of the devices you've added and you can kind of go into each of them. And then if you press the button again, on the screen you get a list of all the commands that device has. Now what that also means is if that device has commands that are also mapped to buttons on the remote, those commands also show up on the screen here and you can't really customize that. So if you go and say AV receiver, for example, you get literally every single command that AV receiver offers all listed in a big list here, which is a bit unwieldy and a bit awkward to work with. Therefore, instead of having that, you have the activities. So we go into the activities section here, and these are the activities that I set up in the app. So we have watch Apple TV, watch Chromecast A, watch Chromecast B, and lighting. And these give you a bit more control over what's displayed on the screen in terms of those commands. So now let's test this out. So we can pick each of these activities, and it'll switch all the inputs around, and then the remote will control that device. So for example, we'll test with the Apple TV. So when I press watch Apple TV, what will happen is a command will be sent to Node-RED, which will trigger Home Assistant to switch the input source to the living room. That then does a whole load of stuff to switch the HDMI matrix to route the Apple TV to the living room. It'll then switch my AV receiver in here to show the output of the HDMI matrix on the TV, and it'll also then send a CEC command to the Apple TV to power it on. So in theory, if we press this, everything will just switch automatically. So right now you can see the TV is just sitting on its main menu, but if I press that button and trigger that activity, there we go. TV switches to the HDMI source, the AV receiver switches to the matrix input, and then up comes the Apple TV. And then, as you saw when I configured the activity, I've set it so all the remote buttons then act as a CEC remote device. So what that does, that sends HTTP commands to Node-RED. Node-RED then works out which particular device is being shown in this room, and then it sends the appropriate CEC command to that device over HDMI. So when I press any of these buttons on the remote, those button commands will essentially be passed through to the Apple TV. So if we use the arrow keys, there we go. I think press OK actually to wake it up. There we go. So now we can use the arrow keys to navigate around the menu like that. Latency isn't terrible. Now, you're not going to play games on, well, you're not going to play games on a remote anyway, but you're not going to play any kind of Apple TV remote control games on this. There is a reasonable latency there, but it's not remotely unusable. It's completely fine for navigating around the interface. So yeah, not really that bad at all. So as you can see, that's now controlling the Apple TV. So obviously that's the Apple TV. What we can then do is we then come back onto the remote and say we want to watch a different source. So we can say I want to watch Chromecast A instead. So we're going to go watch Chromecast A, press that. Once again, TV will switch over, and instead of the Apple TV, we'll get a Chromecast. So there's the Chromecast. Once again, we can press buttons on the remote. That's now sending CEC commands through to the Chromecast, and we can then control that Chromecast from this Sofabaton remote. It works absolutely brilliantly. So the next thing to take a look at is volume control. So as you saw when I did the setup, when I created these activities, I added the AV receiver device to the activity, and I told the activity that I wanted to use the AV receiver for the volume control buttons. That's an infrared integration, so right now the Sofabaton hub is inside the cabinet down there somewhere, and the AV receiver is sitting below it. It is working fine, just kind of sitting on shelves above each other, but if I had any sort of signal, any sort of infrared issues with it not getting to the right device, I could usually stick on IR emitter devices and stick them on the relevant devices, but it's kind of working okay for now. So now if I use the Sofabaton remote, as you can see, we're controlling the volumes. You see the volume control. The one on the right hand side is the TV itself getting that over CEC. The one on the left is the AV receiver itself imposing that over the image. As you can see, I'm controlling the volume using the remote. So this remote is now controlling the audio in here, it's switching all the inputs around, and it's even controlling those remotes, Chromecast and Apple TV devices, over CEC. It works brilliantly. So that was a look at all the AV side of things. The final thing I want to take a look at in terms of the interface on this is those macros that you can add to the activities, which kind of let you put custom options on the screen. So as you can see, you can click these activities, and if you click one of them, it will pick that particular activity, activate it, and then the remote will become that remote. But you can see for some of these activities, in the top right, it has 3 dots, and that indicates that there's additional options hidden under that activity. So if I then click again, it pulls up those options. Now, right now, all I've done is I've added one called Reset Source. All this will do is it will turn off the source, turn off the device, wait a couple of seconds, and then turn it all back on again. It just means that if the state ever goes funny, I end up with the TV kind of stuck on the wrong source, or the device is turned off and doesn't power on, I can kind of just kick it. So if I press that there, it will pick Reset Source. You'll see the Chromecast will turn off. It'll wait a couple of seconds, things will switch around, and everything will power back up again and come on. Just takes a few seconds, and it's just a good way to give it a bit of a kick if it's not quite working. So obviously right now, all I've got is Reset Source, but as you can imagine, you can add basically anything you want here. You can have shortcuts for opening different apps on the TV, shortcuts to do trigger different combinations of things, or say shortcuts and name different lighting scenes that you can trigger. And then speaking of lighting scenes, let's take a look at that. So what we have is I've added another activity here called lighting, and if we trigger that, it'll activate. And this remote will now trigger various lighting scenes through some buttons I've mapped. Now, I've not set up all the lighting in this room yet, smart lighting, I still need to do that. But just to test this out, I've got this lamp down behind the TV here that's hooked up to this remote so we can control it. So when I press buttons on this remote, it'll send an HTTP request to Node-RED, and that will then send appropriate commands to Home Assistant, which then trigger this lamp. So if you use the up and down buttons, this will turn the light on and off. I was going to implement dimming, didn't get round to it, but we can press down, lamp will turn off, press up, lamp will turn on. And then from these color buttons, we can trigger different colors. So we can go red, green, blue, white. So as you can see, that's working. So we can have lighting control now. There's a lot more to do here, and I think for lighting control, I'm more likely to have it where I would select this and have a bunch of named lighting scenes on the screen rather than random AV control buttons, but it kind of shows what you can do. This works absolutely brilliantly. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's take a look at the setup in Node-RED and Home Assistant. So the first thing we'll take a look at here is one of the URLs that I'm using, just to kind of refresh you with what I've got set up on the remote. So we have the IP address of my Home Assistant Node-RED server. I have Node-RED installed as a Home Assistant add-on, and when it's set up there, port 1880 connects directly to Node-RED itself. We then have /endpoint, which is kind of an endpoint within Node-RED itself by default that's used for the HTTP input block. And this doesn't require any authentication. So whereas normally to access this, you'd require authentication to access Node-RED, if you use /endpoint to talk to the HTTP API, you don't need to worry about authentication. Of course, you might want to add something in yourself, but I don't have to deal with that right now. Then we have remote control, and then we have 3 parameters we pass in. The first one is type, which is the type of command I'm issuing. That can either be a CEC command, a lighting command, or a source selection command. We then specify a room, which is the room in the house the device is in. Each different Sofabaton remote will have different rooms. And then in this case, because it's a CEC command, we then have the command that we want to pass as a CEC command. Instead, this might be either a lighting command or it might be a source I want to switch to. We then issue that command and then we just get the same response back. We'll see in a sec, makes it easier, but that's now worked. So now we can see the setup in Node-RED. Now, I'm not going to make this a complete Node-RED tutorial. I do kind of want to do that at some point, do a whole series on that, but that's not going to be this video. But if you're familiar with Node-RED, this might make sense. And if you're not familiar with Node-RED, honestly, just start playing with it. If you can get your head around sort of the idea of how it works and you know basic JavaScript, it's actually quite fun to play with. And once you get your head around it, it's not that unintuitive. So what we have here, first of all, we have an HTTP in block. And what this does is this provides that URL there. So /endpoint is always there. And then I'm saying /endpoint /remote_control, and this accepts HTTP GET requests. You could change that, make it do POST requests, anything like that. The reason I'm using GET requests is purely because it makes it very easy to then specify all the parameters in the URL. So when I'm copying and pasting it between different actions in the Sofabaton app, I only need to copy that URL between them all. If instead I did POST requests and then had a JSON body that I needed to put in, that's 2 separate things I would need to copy and paste into each sort of entity, which makes it a bit harder. So GET requests just keep that a lot simpler. And then in Node-RED, anytime you have an HTTP input block, you then must, from that, trigger an HTTP response node. If you don't do that, what will happen is the HTTP request will just hang because it's waiting for a response. So you could potentially, at this point, form a different response and pass that into the HTTP response node. I'm not doing that. I don't really care about the response. The Sofabaton remote just ignores it. So instead, all I do is my HTTP input node just triggers the response straight away. And that's why the response body contains the request body. It's just because they're passed directly through. That just kind of closes the connection off. This debug block here just shows what's in the request. So we can see here we have different parameters. So for example, that request I just issued here, which was CEC command type, the room was living room and the command was up. We can see here, that's now passed through here as a JSON object. We then have this switch type block that basically takes all this object in here and splits it out based on the type parameter. So if it's a media source, it comes out this output here. If it's a lighting command, it comes out this output here. And if it's a CEC command, it comes out this output here. And then the other blocks handle it differently. So the simplest one we'd have here is this one here, where we take simply the media source and pass it straight into this block here that triggers an action in Home Assistant. So if we go into here, we can see the action is from an input select to select an option. I showed this in my previous video where I did my HDMI matrix setup. So we select the option, and then the particular input select I want to select is picked here, where it's input select media zone, and then I pass in the payload room parameter. So in Home Assistant, they're named after the rooms. So I have media underscore zone underscore LR underscore input for living room, media underscore zone underscore B1 underscore input for the bedroom 1 device, and so on. So I simply just concatenate the room into here, and that selects the appropriate device, appropriate room. And then in terms of the data I pass in the option, which is the option from that list I want to select. And in that case, I basically pick payload.source, which would be a source parameter in the URL up here. On the Home Assistant side, we can go into areas, living room, and we can see in here, we go to media. This is what the select is changing. So when I make that request, it changes this drop down here, and then that triggers further Node-RED logic that switches in the matrix around and all that kind of stuff. I showed that in my previous video, and I'll be going into that in a lot more detail, but this is just showing how you can use that to basically change an entity in Home Assistant. So that block there, when the media source comes in, it sends that action to Home Assistant, which changes this drop down here. The other one that's maybe a bit more sensible to understand is the lighting control, because that's a much more standard thing. So what we have is we switch the type. So if the type parameter is lighting, we then switch the room. We've only got one, so and it's in living room. So then this is if it's living room, we then select the light commands. So the different light commands I here have are on, off, red, green, blue, white, and these would again be specified in the URL. And then depending on what one is picked, so on, off, red, and so on, we have these Home Assistant actions. So this one is for on, and it just simply turns the light on, and this is the living room hue bloom light that we're turning on. If we want to turn it blue, we have, again, light turn on, living room hue bloom, but then we pass in a parameter of the RGB color, and that allows you to trigger that in Home Assistant. The final one is the CEC commands. So what we have is if it's a CEC command, it comes out here. We have this block here that basically from a stored mapping in Node-RED, we have a mapping that is stored by the HDMI matrix logic under here that just maps which room is showing which source. So living room is sitting on in HDMI matrix input 3, bedroom 1 is HDMI matrix input 1, and so on. And then all this does is when it's given a room, it returns the appropriate input. So that's the input on the HDMI matrix that I want to send the CEC command to. Then in this block here, what we do is we generate the CEC command for the matrix. So this is more due to my HDMI matrix. There's a bunch of different commands you can issue it over a telnet interface, which are all detailed in this spreadsheet here. You see all the CEC commands down here. So we generate the command. So it's scec in zone input, which comes out of this block here. So that's the input number of the device I want to control, which is the device that's being displayed in that room. And then payloads.cmd, which is the command I want to give the device, which would be play, pause, back, and so on. And then an exclamation mark to terminate the command. And then this passes out through this link block into the AV distribution flow, which then comes in here and is passed to the HDMI matrix over telnet. This is again a bit out of scope from the remote control setup, but kind of just showing how my logic works. The final block you might see here that's maybe a bit weird is this cycle play / pause. Now this is because with HDMI CEC, at least on my matrix, you can only issue either a play command or a pause command. There's no command for toggling play and pause. So if you issue a pause command, it'll pause but won't play it again. You have to issue a play command to make it play. The issue with that is the Sofabaton X1 remote only has a combined play and pause button, which is a little bit awkward. So all this logic does here is it just remembers the last, is when you press the play pause button, it'll send one, it'll say send play, and then it'll remember the last time it was pressed, it sends play. So the next time you press it, it'll send pause, next time you press it, it'll send play, and so on. So all that means is if the command I pass over the API is play pause, all one word, it'll just cycle. So first time I send it, it'll send, press it, it'll send pause, and second time it'll send play, and so on. It doesn't always mean it's in sync with the device. If the device is playing and I press it, it might send another play command. But what it means is worst case scenario, I have to press the play pause button twice to get it to do the appropriate action, which isn't too bad. So that's kind of what I've set up there. But yeah, that's the setup I've built here. Now, of course, I've used Node-RED for this. You could do whatever you want. All you need to do is present some sort of HTTP API. So you could write your own Python script. You could potentially even use sort of just webhooks directly within Home Assistant. I'm sure that's possible, but this is kind of how I've built it. But yeah, that's kind of a look at the back end of it. But yeah, works really, really nicely. So there you go. That was a look at the new custom HTTP command functionality of the Sofabaton X1S series of smart remotes. And I'm so happy this finally exists. Even though it's a very secret feature they kind of just slipped in there with no fanfare and don't even mention it on their website, I'm so glad this finally exists. And I really can't wait to see what they do with it. I really hope they kind of develop it further, bring in a bunch of additional functionality around allowing you to, for example, clone remotes and make it a bit more efficient and quicker to work with. But this is still such a good start, and I'm so glad I can now finally have physical remote controls to control my whole smart home and multi-room audio distribution over a direct local HTTP connection and not any kind of bodges with IR blasters and things like that. Now, that said, this is still a far from perfect device. The software, especially the app, isn't ideal. It is a little bit buggy. You have issues where like it doesn't sync initially and you have to kind of force to sync the remote. You have issues where the IR codes are kind of weirdly named, and sometimes the particular model that you pick doesn't actually control your TV, even though it's the same model, and you have to pick a different model that's similar. It's a bit quirky, but when you get around that, it does generally work okay. Now, the only issue I had with the HTTP command integration myself was that initially I had it set up so that the Sofabaton hub was on a different VLAN from my Home Assistant server, so the communication between the two was going through my firewall. With that set up there, I found that while it did generally work, if I pressed a lot of buttons kind of in quick succession, say I'm navigating through a menu on a set-top box, after a while it would kind of just stop responding and the Home Assistant server would stop receiving commands. And then if I left the remote unattended for about 30 seconds, it would start working again, which was really, really weird. I tried a bunch of stuff to figure out what was doing it. I couldn't figure it out. But what I ended up doing was moving it so that the Sofabaton hub was on the same subnet as the Home Assistant server, meaning the communication wouldn't go through the firewall. It would go directly between the two devices. And after doing that, I didn't experience any issues. Now, whether that's to do with my firewall setup or the Sofabaton system, I don't really know. All I can really say is it did happen, and I haven't experienced any other issues with the other devices communicating through that firewall in the exact same way I was doing here. So whether it's a weird edge case with my firewall or it's an issue with this, I'm not quite sure. But all I would say is if you do experience that issue where your remote's kind of freezing and then not responding to commands for a while and then starts working again, try making sure that your Sofabaton hub is on the exact same VLAN and subnet as the server it's connecting to, rather than trying to route it or run it through a firewall, and see if that helps. But yeah, it actually works really well. In fact, it works so well, I've actually bought a few more of these so I can finally have them in all the rooms and actually use them for what I was wanting, where I have a remote in each room to control the smart home system in that room. Now, it'll be interesting to see long term how reliable all that is, or whether I live to regret that very expensive decision. But for now, this is definitely the best option I've been able to find on the market. But of course, that doesn't mean my quest is over. There's still a lot of other options out there I really want to take a look at, especially a couple of Kickstarter projects that look really interesting, one of which I'm actually waiting to receive. So I'll still be taking a look at other remote controls and hopefully even better options come out soon. But for now, this is still a pretty good option, as long as you're okay with its quirks. But yeah, hope you found this interesting or potentially useful if you're planning on doing something like this. And if you're interested in buying the Sofabaton X1S, I'll put a link in the description and in a pinned comment. But all that's left to say now is thank you very much for watching.